when things have learned to walk, that ought to crawl.
This happened 2 times one summer, about 15 years ago, with different people a month apart. First time, I was camping in the woods with my friend and her family. After dinner one night, her uncle started telling us about paranormal experiences he had in his home country. My friend has roots in Southeast Asia. They were creepy tales, and being a lover of horror movies, I was thrilled, to say the least. After story time, my friend's cousins and I, a total of 3, went out ghost hunting. The campground was one of those that had dirt roads, and in between them are trees and the sites for tents and whatnot. We started walking, passing where people were camped, and ended up at the edge of where it was just dark forest. Before we got there, the younger cousin fled back to the campsite due to fear. Me and the remaining cousin laughed as we were both brave, or stupid, teenagers. Anyways, we're walking down the road, looking into the darkness, when all of a sudden, I see this white humanoid thing. And by white, I mean stark white. I described it as fluorescent, which isn't entirely accurate, as it didn't give off light, but it was bright enough to see in the dark. Safe to say, it was spooky. I asked the cousin to shine the light on the thing, but he said he was frozen in fear. Shortly after that, we bolted back to the camp. Now at this point, I could have chalked it up to our minds playing tricks on us after literally going out ghost hunting because we were told ghost stories, which I did for a while. That is, until the next time I saw it. The second time was back in my town, which is about 90 miles away and in the middle of suburbia. This time I was out with 2 friends and we were driving around doing dumb teenager shit. We ended up parking at one of the parks in our town. Now this park is massive. It has a bunch of sports fields, hills, a giant playground, a lake, and even an outdoor amphitheater with big grass steps for seating. We ended up at the top of these grass steps, and we're staring at the sky, enjoying the beautiful starry night. Then, I look down at the stage, which has a building attached for dressing rooms, and I see the white humanoid again, peering out from behind the building. I turn to my friends and ask them if they see it too, and they both say yes. Then we go down to investigate, but find nothing behind the building or in the woods behind it. My friends may have been high, but I was sober. I didn't try to trick them, I just asked them and they both said yes, and looked freaked out. We left after that. I haven't seen this thing since, which is okay by me. I've tried to explain it to myself with the aforementioned doubts, mind-playing tricks, high friends, but seeing it on 2 occasions with different people is where I'm stumped. I don't know what it could have been. Also, I never mentioned the first encounter to my friends who were with me during the second encounter, so no power of suggestion there. I recently heard of tall whites, and maybe that was an encounter with them, but the only similarity is the whiteness, as this thing was not particularly tall. Anyways, if anyone can help explain to me what this was, that would be great. I was about 4 years old when I first saw it. My stepfather at the time warned me not to get too close to the trees or it would get me. But I wanted to play outside anyway, so I stepped outside and peered around because the trailer I lived in at the time was right next to a forest. And when I turned to look at the corner that was near the trees, a black, massive thing with yellow eyes peered around the side at me and grabbed the side of the house with inky claws. For years, I asked my mother what it was, because she's no longer with my stepdad, and she doesn't remember anything from the night besides me running inside screaming and crying. My stepfather at the time had no recollection of ever warning me of anything either. Eventually, I forgot about it until 3 years ago. I was sharing a room with a roommate and we were home alone and laughing. I got up to get snacks, but she suddenly stops laughing and says, "Don't go out there. He's waiting for you." which of course struck an intense fear within me. I asked her to repeat what she just said, and immediately she looked confused and said, "I didn't say anything." Obviously I was freaked out and made her leave the room first. Thankfully nothing happened, but as I lived in that apartment, I dreamt about that thing crawling out of my closet and trapping me in my room. I could see it had large antlers and a body of a man, inky claws and rabbit skull for a head. It got to the point where I asked to switch rooms because I thought I was just paranoid about the closet. But then my roommate, when she took over the room, claims she woke up to something standing in the corner watching her. She described the antlers, but for some reason, it didn't bother her, so she stayed in the room. Eventually I moved to where I live now, and the back of the house is once again against a lining of trees. I work third shift, so when I leave for work, every now and then I get a very sickly scared feeling in my gut that it is going to come around the corner, so I run to the car. This feeling happened 2 nights ago, and I don't know what it is, but I'm afraid it's trying to find me, and it's unsettling because hardly anyone takes me seriously about it lately. It doesn't feel like a demon. It feels more than that, more cryptid-like. I've googled anything that might resemble antlers, a rabbit skull, and the body of a man. It also just looks like it dipped itself in a lot of ink and tar. I used to call it the boogeyman, but now I'm not sure. I know it wants to do me harm though. This one takes place in the early 1960s. It happened to my father and his elder sister. He was around 4 or 5 years old, and she was around 12 to 13. This is from my aunt who shared the story. At that time, my father was living with his family, his father, his mother, and his sister, in his native village in Africa, Ivory Coast, West Africa. It is a small village of around 1,500 to 2,000 people. When they're not at school, my father and aunt accompanied their parents to the field. So to explain a bit, in our country it's not like in Europe or the USA where fields are nearby farms. There, the fields are located far from the villages, sometimes 5 to 10 kilometers in the dense forest. So every morning except Sunday, villagers are walking 2 to 3 hours through the rainforest to reach their fields, work, and at around 4 p.m. they make their way back, again through the forest, to return to the village before nightfall, carrying either food or firewood for cooking, or sometimes both. There is no road, just narrow trails in the forest. It can be scary, but usually it is pretty safe if you take the trails. Sometimes you can meet snakes, foxes, monkeys, large birds, that kind of animal. Before there were elephants and big cats, but no more now because of deforestation and poaching. Well, that day my father and his eldest sister accompanied their father, my grandfather, in the field. Everything went normally as usual. On their way back, since Grandpa was carrying a lot, he walked more slowly. So my aunt and my father, who were just carrying little stuff, walked faster and pulled away from him. My aunt walked in front of my father and they did not speak, eager to get home. The trip went off without a hitch. Suddenly, at one point my aunt had a strange feeling of emptiness behind her. She turned to see that her little brother was not there. Surprised, she started shouting the name of my father. To no answer. She started to panic. Since he was behind her, the only places he could be would be behind her. So she threw her charge and began to run by retracing the steps, while shouting the name of her little brother. For several minutes she saw nothing. Then at one point she spotted, several meters in front of her on the trail, what she described as a tiny creature, around 110 to 120 centimeters. And this little creature walked, carrying a little boy on its back. She said that the creature seemed to have its feet positioned upside. She stared, shocked. Then, she shouted loudly to the creature, "Hey you!" to ensure that was what she thought. The creature turned back to my aunt. It was not human, and that was definitely my father on its back. When the creature saw my aunt, it started running, still with my father on its back. My aunt started running too to pursue it. The creature left the trail to get into the dense forest It was not counting on the determination of my aunt to enter the forest after it. She pursued them throughout the forest for several minutes. Since she was more agile and faster than the creature, which was slowed with its charge on its back, she finally caught up. She lunged at him, screaming, "Give me back my brother! Give me back my brother!" grabbing her brother and pulling him back. The creature also grabbed onto my father. Then, seeing that my aunt was clinging, he let go of my father, who fell to the ground, and the creature vanished before her eyes. My father was groggy and looked dazed. My aunt took him by the hand and they went out of the forest to go home. Once at home, when he regained consciousness, Grandpa and Grandma, my aunt had told them what had happened, asked him how he ended up on the back of this creature. He said he saw no creature. He said he walked behind his sister when the creature appeared to him as the doppelganger of his father. It came from behind and asked him if he was tired and asked him to climb on its back to go home. So he agreed because he thought it was his father. During all this time, and even when this sister was pursuing the creature, he saw himself on the back of his father. My grandpa was 175 centimeters in height, and the creature 110 to 120, until he fell to the ground. The incident did not occur again. They never knew what had happened to kidnap my father. But I know until today, sometimes there are cases of disappearances through the forest, especially children. When I was a little girl and I sometimes went to the fields, we were asked to stay in a group on the trail and not to respond if we heard someone call us in the forest. I want to share my encounter with a humanoid. This is not really an encounter, since the humanoid did not see me, but I think it's interesting anyway. The sighting took place in October 2004 in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. I was spending a few weeks off in my parents' house. The house of my parents was a single-story house with a large garden in the front yard and outbuildings in the backyard. My room was located in the main house with a large window pane that had a view of both the garden and the outbuildings. It was 1 p.m. that day. I was lying in bed just thinking when suddenly something caught my eye to the window. I looked out, thinking I was seeing someone from the house, but to my surprise it was a non-human creature. The creature was rather small, 110 to 120 centimeters in height, very skinny, very thin arms with a big egg-shaped head without visible ears. It had a very nice bright white-blue color and slick skin. It looked like it radiated slightly. Unfortunately, from my position, I only saw its profile and its back. The creature walked past the window quietly and headed towards the backyard. It seemed very at ease, walked calmly and unhurriedly, and knew where it was going. It did not look in my direction. The distance between us was about 4 meters. It disappeared from my sight around the wall that separates the garden and the outbuildings. I was so scared. I stayed still, in the bed, so as not to be noticed. There were people in the house that day, but no one seems to have seen this creature. My family recently bought a beautiful but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia, Canada. It's a wonderful place, but my dad is frustrated with the amount of work they will have to do to live comfortably on our land. I personally love our little pocket of untouched nature, but I'm getting off the topic. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I chalked it up to the uneven ground and abundance of plants. My family brought their trailer to the land and were staying in it, while I set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around the fire pit, stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land, when we started to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, but also unlike any animal either of us have ever heard. It was a shrill yet guttural growl that was extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or a cougar got cornered, but listening more closely quickly crushed that assumption. I started to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon started to sound like a bear was cornering something, and the threatened creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now, I know you're probably thinking it must have been a cougar or something, but I've heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls sounded almost demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I both decided it would be best to head to bed. While laying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After approaching, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down and getting comfortable. I started to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking me, until I worked up the courage to peek at my tent's window. In the spot I heard the creature approach, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this, except I made eye contact with the bear and felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know this sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us to protect us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard the blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature, much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, brought itself to its feet, and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I swung my head to see where the noise was coming from, and got a glance of an incredibly large deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long pale arms and legs that ended with hooves. But it was also covered in a very dark, blood-like substance, implying that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I saw the trees sway and break where it was running, and then it stopped a far distance away from our land and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in that area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back at the bear, and it was once again sitting, looking at me with its kind, protective eyes. I've never been more grateful to have a bear living nearby, and no longer fear them, but respect them. This is a story of my encounters with the Brunswick sludge walker. My first experience was May 27th, 2016. The only reason I remember this day is because it was my best friend's birthday. I'm not really sure what time it was, but it had been dark for a couple of hours. I was pretty young around this time, like 13 or so my memory is a bit fuzzy surrounding this experience. My friend had a birthday party that I was attending, and I planned on staying the night. It was just him, another friend, and I staying the night. Shortly after everyone else left, my friend's older brother started telling us about a monster in the woods at Hopkins Park. We didn't really believe him, but he seemed to believe it at least. Eventually, he offered to drive us to the park and go through the woods and prove it to us. Being young kids, never having experienced being somewhere like that unsupervised at night, we eagerly jumped at the chance. We all piled in his little car, and we went to the park. It was like a 10-minute drive, but it went by so fast. We didn't really act excited or anything, but I could tell that we all had the same excitement going on internally. We get to the park, and he parked in the gravel lot. Strangely, there was another car there. We didn't think much of it, but in hindsight, we should have realized that something was up. We got out of the car and my friend pulled out a flashlight. His older brother almost immediately snatched it out of his hands, claiming that since he was the oldest one, he got to use the flashlight, or something like that. After that, we headed straight for some specific path through the woods. Again, this should have seemed suspicious, but we were kids that were just excited to be there. Not long after entering, the flashlight started to flicker and eventually turn off. Again, pretty suspicious. Shortly after that, we heard something walking towards us from the woods. We all froze. It sounded like it stopped right behind us. Then at the same time, my best friend and I both felt a hand on our shoulders. We both screamed and ran out while hearing his brother laughing. Turns out the hand we felt belonged to the older brother's friend, who was in a black morph suit. We felt really dumb for even believing that there was something in the woods, and the older brother and his friend continued to laugh. While they were laughing, we heard this weird howl come from the woods. They froze, but we assumed it was just another prank on their end. They looked mortified, but my two friends and I figured it was another one of their friends in the woods trying to prank us again. Not wanting them to get the pleasure of pranking us again, we headed towards the sound. They tried to stop us, claiming it wasn't them, but we didn't buy it. We trekked through the woods, and we heard the sound once again, but it was much closer this time around. We stopped and looked around, trying to adjust our eyes to our surroundings. I felt a hand on my chest at one point, trying to get my attention. I soon realized what he saw. It was a pair of these glowing orange eyes, easily 10 feet off the ground. We didn't freeze this time. We ran. We found the older brother and his friend, and they didn't believe our experience. They just assumed that it was our attempt to get back at them. But that was simply not the case. We then went back to my friend's house. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I would close my eyes, I would see those eyes. As time went on, the memory faded from my mind. I somehow seemingly forgot that this encounter had even taken place. I think I may have suppressed the memory to keep my sanity. Fast forward a few years and I am 15. I'm not sure about the date on this one, but it was a weekend in June of 2018. My friends and I would ride bikes around Brunswick, even late at night. Brunswick is a quiet city where you don't need to worry about being out late at night. It's a really safe place, so our parents weren't concerned about us being out late at night. On this particular night, we wanted to go to the playground attached to the school across the street from Hopkins Park. Applewood Elementary, I think it's called. It has this really big blue sign that lights up at night that partially illuminates the area surrounding it. We made it to the park and just hung out on the playground equipment, talking about random stuff. It's also worth mentioning that it was pretty foggy that night, which gave everything an ominous feel. It was pretty cool, actually. The fog around the school was seemingly blue, and that was pretty interesting. Not long after, we became disinterested in what we were doing, and eventually decided on visiting Hopkins Park. There's a pavilion at the center of the park, so we headed there. We sat on the benches and talked for a bit, until we eventually heard a sound coming from the woods. At this moment, I immediately remembered my experience from years earlier. I was mortified. My friends wanted to check it out, but I pleaded with them not to. They then made jokes about me being a baby or whatever, and they somehow persuaded me to go check it out with them. We entered the woods, and we didn't notice much at first. The screeching stopped as we grew closer. I'm not sure why, but this made me even more anxious than I already was. One of my friends wanted to investigate further, so he went off the path and into the dense woods in the direction of where the sound was coming from. We all listened intently as he carelessly trudged through the woods. His footsteps abruptly stopped, and seconds later we heard him scream. We all jumped, but we didn't really move much from where we were. I wanted to go, but my other friends were not going to let that happen. We then saw our friend dash out of the woods, nearly tripping over his own feet. We were too focused on him to notice that something was following him. Soon, we saw the same glowing eyes which I had seen before. It towered over us. It then let out a terrifying screech, a sound like one which would be made in agony. We ran out of the park, leaving our bikes behind. We ended up going to a friend's house who was not with us that night. He lived kind of close to Applewood. His parents were pretty cool and offered to drive us all home. In the morning, I had asked my mum to drive me to the park to get my bike. Naturally, she asked me why I left my bike there. I'm not sure why, but I gave my mum the actual story of what happened. Somehow, she actually believed me. She then told me all about the Hopkins monster, how she didn't encounter it, but she knew plenty of people that did, how there are deer corpses found twisted up in the woods with no signs of them being eaten, and the police are always there at night for some reason. It really stuck with me. My mum was not one to believe in things like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster, but she seemed dead set on the existence of this monster. My next encounter was on October 25th, 2019. It was a few days before Halloween, and my friends and I were really into the holiday. We always liked Halloween, but this year was different. We all knew this would be our last real Halloween as kids. I mean, we were all in high school, and we were admittedly a bit too old for trick-or-treating, but we still decided to go one last time. With this in mind, we wanted to make the most out of the month. We spent a lot of time in the woods of parks in our city, hanging out and doing whatever it is teenagers do. Something about the chilly wind and the colourful leaves made being in the woods pretty special. On this particular day, we went to the woods of Hopkins Park after school. The last encounter I had was still in the back of my mind, but I figured nothing would happen while I was there during the day, and I was right. That day was pretty normal, mundane even. We ventured sort of deep into the woods, and it quickly became pretty dense. Soon we all began to smell an incredibly foul stench. Honestly, I've never smelled anything quite as gross as I did that day. It was my best guess as to what a rotting corpse would smell like, and I was sort of right. We walked in the direction of the smell and we found a deer corpse. I've never seen a dead deer up close before, so it was a strange experience. On top of that, its body was twisted up in a strange way, almost unnaturally even. I then realized that it hadn't been touched by any predatory animals, as far as I could tell. I then remembered the conversation I had with my mum about a year earlier. I told my friends about that, and only one of them had ever heard of there being a monster at the park before. We all agreed to come back that night to investigate. I was a bit braver this time around, I suppose. We met up at about 11 o'clock that night at the pavilion. We spent about an hour in the woods to no avail. We expected to find this creature almost immediately, but that was simply not the case. We pretty much gave up, and at this point, I began to doubt my own experiences. We were about to leave when one of my friends went into the woods to pee. Obviously, he went alone. We all waited for him to finish up before leaving, and talked while standing around. Suddenly we heard him fall over and let out a little shout. Right after, we heard a howl from what we could only assume was the monster that dwells within the woods. Then our friend ran out of the woods, moving faster than I've ever seen him run. He had mud on his jeans, and what I assumed to be his own piss on his shirt and pants. We followed him as he ran out of the park, all of us being terrified. We tried to figure out exactly what he saw, but he wasn't able to really convey anything worthwhile. Truthfully, I'm not sure he even knows what he saw. Regardless, it really left an impact on him, and he seemed really paranoid for the next few weeks. He didn't even come trick-or-treating with us, which was very unlike him. We would talk to others about this experience, and rarely would they believe us. I certainly understand why they didn't. A few months later, someone suggested that we get a picture of the creature to prove its existence. It was the beginning of winter at this point, so it, theoretically, would be easy to get a picture of the monster as it could not hide behind leaves of trees. Unfortunately, it wasn't snowing a lot around this time. But if it was, that would have been even better, as white snow could contrast against its slick black body. Only one of my friends from the last encounter was willing to go with me to try getting a picture, but that was much better than going alone. This was my final encounter, and it took place on December 14th, 2019. I don't remember the time we were there, but it was past midnight. We ventured into the woods with our phones out, ready to take a picture. We didn't find anything, but we did hear a sound, which we think was caused by it. After hearing that, we eagerly went in the direction of the sound. Unfortunately, we couldn't find it. It was at this point that I started feeling watched. In hindsight, this could have been just paranoia setting in, which would be expected. We kept going through the woods, and as time went on, we both started seeing stuff out of the corners of our eyes. At first, it was minor things like trees moving abnormally, but then it evolved into seeing glowing eyes or even the shape of the creature. The uneasiness we felt began to grow to the point where we felt the need to leave. We were disappointed that we didn't see it, but relieved to finally leave. We put our phones away and headed towards the exit of the woods. Just as we exited the woods, we heard something run towards us. We instinctively ran, and I thought to pull out my phone. Looking behind me as I ran, I took a couple of pictures. Only one was worth viewing, as it was not blurry. The picture I took can be seen on screen now. It was taken pretty close to the gravel lot. This was the last time I went to that park, and I don't think I'll ever go again. I have the proof I wanted of this creature's existence, and that's all I wanted. I feel like this can go without saying, but I don't recommend anyone going to Hopkins Park in Brunswick at night. I live down in Central Texas. It started with a friend of mine, Luke, needing a ride back to town from Houston. He's like family, so I went and brought him on back. He stays kind of near the Dripping Springs area. Before he was in Houston, he and I always heard some strange sounds at night on his property, but we always shrugged it off. He's got livestock, so we often protect them from coyotes and other things. Plus, we normally shoot guns out there, so we don't really worry about what's lurking out there. The night I brought him back, we pulled into his long driveway to head to the house, and along the driveway he has this fire pit about 40 feet away from said road. Down by the pit, from the car, we both noticed two blue-bordered, massive yellow eyes in my headlight beams staring straight at us. I said, "Luke, what the F? Do you see that?" As I reached for my flashlight and one of my firearms, and I jumped out of my car window and ran straight to the gleaming eyes. They seemed to blink once and then vanished into the dark. I ran to where I saw it standing and looked all around. The whole FBI flashlight handgun stance. Scanning. I hear footsteps approaching from behind. Startling at first, but these steps were from Luke coming up behind me, yelling, "Watch out, watch out." I turn around to him a few feet away. He'd stopped. He looked confused and looks around. He then said, It was right behind you, and was waist high." I think to myself, what's waist high and has night vision? Mountain lions? So that's what I thought for a moment. Still, standing in that spot, he says, "We need more gear." So we went to my car. We geared up, killed the engine, then back to the trees. We approached the tree line, aiming the lights to the trees about waist high. Then, I beam my light upwards and see those same eyes dart in a straight line to our left, further into the trees, away from my car and away from his house. Now we're spooked. How is it 9 to 10 feet up in the air or trees without making a single noise? No wing flap, no twigs, footsteps, just dead silence. It's about 2:30 a.m. now. We had been following and going the direction we saw the eyes trail towards, staying very quiet. Suddenly, out of the thicket, about 8 feet in front of me, I see the eyes open within the darkness of the woods. Massive, glowing, and a few inches apart, which made me assume that this creature has size on its side. It stared into me. I stared back. I'm facing this unknown creature at this moment, and I shakily ask, "Luke, are you seeing this?" Not moving my flashlight and not breaking eye contact. I want to know where this thing is, and I want to know if it moves. "I don't, dude. What do you see?" "Luke, are you sure you don't see this?" "I don't. What is it?" I assume the only reason he did not see the eyes is because of my flashlight and my angle with the beam. He was not standing directly in front of the creature, as he was about 6 feet to my right at the moment. So I understand why he couldn't see what I saw due to angle and perspective. After that little back and forth, I see it approach me. It got closer. Hell no. I raised my handgun. I said, "I'm firing," and then fired at this unknown being directly between the eyes. The round I fired stirred up a lot of shit. We heard a very short but low-pitched growl or grunt, followed by what sounded like something very heavy, easily heavier than myself, knocking into a couple of the trees around it. Above, the birds in that tree dispersed. We heard no footsteps, no retreating, and staying there a few moments longer, listening, scanning. We stayed out there, waiting to hear or see anything else for about an hour after that. But the night was quiet and calm afterwards. We go inside, call it a weird day, and go to bed. Next morning, we went to where we spotted and fired. There, we found a bunch of triangle-shaped footprints that led to the fence. we look up. There's a break in the top fencing's wires. Right on the other side of the break, a few limbs and branches had been freshly broken off as they lay on the ground. Some remained dangling and facing the forest floor, like where you would land if you were to jump from the wire break at the top. This is all I have on this story, other than the fact that my friend and I, to this day, still occasionally see those eyes at night, in our dreams and in our windows. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.